killing me inside. I miss my baby.
Without a doubt, we know that my daughter was not a drug user, and I had a second autopsy myself, paid out of pocket, because we felt so uncomfortable with the way it was handled.
Life is not the same. I don't know who I'm gonna be after this.
Lauren Smith Fields had been dead for 2 days. Her body had already been removed, an autopsy had already been performed, and the Bridgeport Police Department, the department sworn to serve and protect, had already decided that her family didn't need to know. 23 years old, found unresponsive in her own bed, blood trickling from her nose, after a first date with a man she met on a dating app. And the detective assigned to her case looked her grieving family in the eye and told them he hadn't bothered to call because, and these were his words, they already had her passport and her ID. They knew who she was. Then he hung up on her father. The bloody sheets were still in the apartment. A used condom, a mystery pill, evidence sitting in a dead girl's bedroom, untouched, uncollected, abandoned, while the man who woke up next to her body walked away that morning without being detained, without being questioned, described by investigators as a nice guy. The medical examiner would later say Lauren died by accident. A lethal mix of fentanyl, promethazine, hydroxyzine, and alcohol in her system. Drugs her family says she never used. Drugs no one has ever been held accountable for putting in her body. So how did they get there? Who brought them? And why did an entire police department seem determined to make sure nobody ever found out? Welcome to Real Crime Stories. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to the cases that demand to be told, the victims who deserve more than silence, more than a note on a door, more than a system that looked the other way. If that means something to you, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss a case. We do this for them. Now let's talk about Lauren. Lauren Smith Fields was the kind of person who filled every room she walked into. Born January 23, 1998, she grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a city that would ultimately fail her in the most devastating fashion imaginable. Those closest to her described a vibrant, warm, deeply caring young woman whose smile could disarm strangers and whose laughter was something people remembered long after she left. Her brother Tavar called her bright. Her mother Chantel simply called her everything. At 23, Lauren was navigating life the way millions of young people do, working, building connections, trying to find joy wherever it could be found. Dating apps had become a normal avenue for that generation, and Bumble was where she matched with Matthew LaFountain, a 37-year-old white man whose profile gave little reason for alarm. They exchanged messages. They made plans. And on December 11, 2021, LaFountain arrived at Lauren's apartment for what appeared to be a casual evening between two adults getting acquainted. The night itself seemed ordinary on its surface. Tequila poured, food prepared, a movie chosen and queued up on the television. Two people settling into the kind of relaxed domesticity that first dates sometimes drift toward when nerves dissolve and conversation flows easily. Nothing about that Saturday evening, by outward appearances, signaled catastrophe. Neighbors heard nothing alarming. No arguments reported. No disturbance logged. Just a quiet building on a quiet night in December. Then morning arrived and everything changed. At approximately 6:30 a.m. on December 12th, LaFountain awoke to find Lauren lying beside him, completely unresponsive. Blood was visible at her nostril. He reached for his phone and dialed emergency services, performing chest compressions as instructed by the operator while help made its way to the building. Paramedics arrived and worked the scene with urgency, but there was nothing left to save. Lauren Smith Fields was pronounced dead before the sun had fully risen over Bridgeport. First responders noted that LaFountain appeared visibly shaken, trembling, distressed, exhibiting signs consistent with genuine shock. That observation would later be used, almost reflexively, as justification for how gently authorities handled him throughout what followed. He cooperated with initial questioning at the scene. He provided a version of events. And then, without being placed under any formal scrutiny, without having his background examined with any urgency, without being classified even loosely as a person requiring deeper investigation, he left. Inside that apartment, the picture investigators encountered should have triggered immediate, aggressive evidence preservation. Bloodied bedding, a condom that had been used, a pill discovered among Lauren's belongings. These were not peripheral details. They were potential answers to questions a 23-year-old's unexplained passing absolutely demanded. Standard protocol in any suspicious death scenario requires thorough documentation, collection, and chain of custody handling for exactly these kinds of physical materials. None of that happened. Instead, days later, when Lauren's grieving relatives arrived at her apartment to begin collecting her possessions, still reeling from the shock of receiving no official notification, having instead read a landlord's handwritten message on a door, they made a discovery that should never have been possible. The evidence was still there, sitting exactly as it had been left, unsecured, uncollected. Treated with the same carelessness that had characterized every decision the Bridgeport Police Department made from the moment officers arrived at that building. Her family gathered those items themselves. Meanwhile, Detective Angel Lanos, the officer assigned to lead the investigation into Lauren's passing, had apparently concluded that urgency was unnecessary. Notification could wait. Follow-up could wait. The family could wait. After all, investigators possessed her identification documents. In their assessment, that apparently satisfied every obligation owed to a daughter, a sister, a human being whose final hours remained completely unexplained. This was not an oversight rooted in negligence alone. This was a pattern deliberate in its indifference, familiar in its target, and devastating in its consequences for a family already drowning in grief, who now had to fight simply to be treated as though their loss mattered at all. Lauren deserved answers from minute one. Instead, she got silence. Chantel Fields had buried her composure somewhere between that landlord's note and the moment a detective told her, over the telephone, that nobody felt obligated to reach out. She had driven to Lauren's building expecting to find her child. She found abandonment instead, institutional, cold, and unapologetic. When she pressed for explanations, pressed for accountability, pressed for basic human acknowledgement that something catastrophic had occurred, officers stonewalled her at every turn. Then came the phone call where Detective Lanos reportedly hung up on Lauren's grieving father. That single act, dismissive, contemptuous, utterly revealing, crystallized precisely what this bereaved household was dealing with. Not bureaucratic incompetence buried beneath paperwork and overwhelm. Something far more corrosive. A fundamental disregard for Black lives that manifested not through dramatic hostility, but through routine indifference. The quiet, devastating assumption that certain families simply require less consideration than others. Bridgeport Mayor Joe Ganim eventually acknowledged the department's conduct as unacceptable. He issued a public apology, characterizing what unfolded as a catastrophic leadership failure. Yet beneath those carefully chosen political words sat an uncomfortable reality. 2 Black women had perished in Bridgeport on the exact same calendar date, December 12th, and neither family received proper notification. 53-year-old Brenda Lee Rawls was discovered deceased that very morning, blocks across town. Her relatives also learned of her passing through unofficial channels. 2 households shattered by identical institutional abandonment, different addresses, identical treatment. Coincidence becomes pattern when it happens twice simultaneously. Social media erupted. Under the rallying hashtag Justice for Lauren Smith Fields, thousands across multiple platforms amplified what mainstream outlets had initially buried. TikTok creators, Instagram activists, and concerned citizens pushed Lauren's story into national consciousness with relentless consistency. Rapper Cardi B amplified awareness through Twitter, reaching audiences numbering in the tens of millions. Attorney Darnell Crosland later acknowledged publicly that this digital momentum proved instrumental in pressuring authorities toward meaningful action, something conventional advocacy alone had struggled to accomplish. Protesters gathered outside Morton Government Center demanding transparency, accountability, and genuine answers regarding how investigators had conducted themselves. Photographs circulated. Testimonies spread. Pressure mounted until Bridgeport's leadership could no longer afford comfortable silence. Detectives were suspended, placed on administrative leave pending internal review. The supervising officer overseeing both cases resigned. Mayor Ganim referred departmental conduct to the Office of Internal Affairs for formal examination. Connecticut's governor took notice. National correspondents began arriving. Suddenly, a case authorities had treated as unremarkable demanded extraordinary attention from every direction. Then came January 2022, and the medical examiner's ruling landed like a second blow. Acute intoxication, accidental, caused by simultaneous presence of fentanyl, promethazine, hydroxyzine combined with alcohol consumption. Officially recorded, officially filed, officially closed as far as certain authorities seemed concerned. Case categorized, box checked, move along. Except Lauren's loved ones refused. Crossland articulated what so many found troubling about that determination. He had never encountered a ruling of accidental overdose issued without first establishing who supplied the substances, through what means ingestion occurred, or under precisely what circumstances a healthy 23-year-old consumed a combination lethal enough to stop her heart while beside a man she had known for mere hours. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid exponentially stronger than morphine, does not typically appear in someone's bloodstream without explanation. Promethazine and hydroxyzine are prescription antihistamines rarely carried recreationally. Their simultaneous presence alongside tequila raised questions the official ruling simply declined to pursue. Her relatives maintained consistently, firmly, and publicly, Lauren did not use narcotics. Period. So where did those substances originate? LaFountain was never formally designated a suspect. Criminal charges were never pursued against him individually. Federal DEA assistance was enlisted to trace fentanyl sourcing through broader supply networks rather than focusing investigative energy squarely on the person present throughout Lauren's final conscious hours. Beyond institutional negligence, beyond chemical mysteries, beyond protests and suspensions and carefully worded mayoral statements, one devastating truth remained standing. A vibrant 23-year-old had drawn her last breath beside a virtual stranger, and every system positioned to deliver justice had either stumbled, retreated, or actively chosen comfort over courage. Lauren's circle refused to accept that conclusion. They were just beginning. Grief, when it hardens, becomes something else entirely. Chantel Fields transformed hers into litigation, into legislation, into a refusal so absolute and unwavering that Bridgeport's corridors of power ultimately had no choice but to reckon with what they had done, and what they had deliberately left undone. Where bureaucratic machinery expected exhaustion, Lauren's household delivered relentless, organized, strategically executed pursuit of accountability that stretched across courtrooms, Capitol buildings, and national headlines simultaneously. Attorney Crossland filed a staggering $30 million civil lawsuit targeting multiple defendants at once. The city of Bridgeport, individual officers whose conduct had proven catastrophic, and Bumble itself, the platform through which Lauren first connected with LaFountain. The Bumble inclusion raised eyebrows among legal observers, broadening liability arguments beyond municipal negligence into corporate responsibility territory. Did platforms facilitating connections between strangers carry any duty regarding user safety? Could digital matchmaking infrastructure bear partial accountability when those connections ended in tragedy? These questions pushed boundaries of existing precedent in genuinely unprecedented directions. Simultaneously, Connecticut's General Assembly took action that transcended this singular tragedy. Legislators introduced House Bill 5349, nicknamed Lauren's Law in her honor, requiring every police jurisdiction throughout the state to formally notify deceased individuals' next of kin within 24 hours of discovery, without exception. Republicans and Democrats set aside partisan positioning entirely. The measure passed unanimously, receiving bipartisan green lights that Crossland described as validation that Lauren's suffering had catalyzed something permanent and protective. Other Connecticut households would never endure what Chantel endured, reading a stranger's handwriting on a door to learn her firstborn had already been autopsied and relocated without a single courtesy notification. That legislative victory carried bittersweet weight impossible to fully articulate. Because passing laws cannot resurrect daughters, suspending detectives cannot recover squandered evidence. $30 million figures attached to lawsuits cannot restore a birthday Lauren would never celebrate, a graduation photograph that would never materialize, grandchildren Chantel would never hold. Every structural gain achieved through tireless advocacy existed permanently, alongside an absence that no courtroom ruling could ever fill. Meanwhile, substantive mysteries surrounding December 12th remained stubbornly unresolved. LaFountain's background, scrutinized belatedly by independent researchers and citizen journalists once national coverage intensified, revealed details investigators apparently never prioritized during critical early hours. Questions about his movements prior to arriving at Lauren's residence, about substances potentially introduced during their shared evening, about precisely when, and how a lethal pharmaceutical combination entered her physiology. None received definitive public answers supported by prosecutorial action. The DEA investigation into fentanyl sourcing produced no publicly announced charges directly connected to Lauren's passing specifically. Suspended detectives appealed their disciplinary outcomes. Successfully, both were reinstated. That reinstatement felt, to Lauren's supporters, like confirmation of everything they had articulated from the very beginning, that consequences within systems protecting their own would always prove temporary, symbolic rather than structural, performative gestures toward accountability rather than genuine reckoning. Hashtags trend and then recede. Cameras eventually redirect elsewhere. Politicians pivot toward fresher controversies. And institutions quietly restore themselves to their prior configurations. Once sustained attention migrates onward. Lauren's family understood this rhythm intimately, which is precisely why Chantel refused migration, refused comfortable silence, refused the gradual dimming that institutions count upon when pursuing accountability over sustained periods becomes socially inconvenient. She continued pressing, continued speaking, continued insisting publicly that her daughter represented not merely one isolated casualty of systemic failure, but rather one visible, named, photographed, beloved example of patterns affecting thousands of Black women annually across America. Women whose disappearances and deaths generate fractions of investigative resources, media coverage, and prosecutorial urgency, routinely extended toward victims fitting different demographic profiles. Lauren Smith Fields deserved every resource, every urgent hour, every collected piece of physical material left carelessly behind in that apartment. She deserved a knock on her mother's door, not a note. She deserved officers who treated her final hours with the gravity any human being's unexplained death commands, regardless of zip code, regardless of complexion, regardless of whether cameras had yet arrived to witness how authorities conducted themselves. She was 23, bright, beloved, irreplaceable, and she is still waiting for justice.